This blue scrappy quilt started as a pile of tiny leftovers and turned into something much prettier than I expected. See how you can look in your scrap pile and think there's not a single matching piece in here. Then you make a quilt that surprises you. I'm using up all these tiny blue bits. It takes longer to cut, every piece is different, but I love how much variety and life it adds to the finished quilt. These are the 2.5-inch blue squares that I've cut up to now. And while I'm over here doing this, if I've got bigger pieces, I'm cutting these to put to one side for another potato chip quilt later. I've got a regular rotary cutter and a small ruler, and I've got a bigger ruler on standby in case I have to move on to some bigger pieces. It's slower, but it's satisfying turning all leftovers into something pretty. Lots of sorting here. Too narrow, too pale. Okay, so that one will work. So let's check it's 2.5 inches. Yeah, and I'm just going to cut that. And when I'm cutting, I usually use a combination of the cutting mat and the ruler to measure with. For this quilt, I think I need around 400. And I'm pretty close. I'm sure I'm pretty close with the pile that I've got there. But as soon as I've got this fabric out, I'm just going to cut some more into potato chip size as well. I think I spend more time discarding than actually cutting. Now here's a piece that's been a jelly roll, a leftover piece of jelly roll, so we can cut this. So I'm going to continue cutting. As you can see, I've actually got quite a lot here ready. As well as this, I'll also need to cut some either white or cream. I'll give you the measurements for those pieces, and then we'll get started making this quilt. You also need some white for background. So this is 2.5 by 4.5, and you need 64 of those. 2.5 by 6.5, and you need 64 of those. That's for this pattern. I'm doing 16 blocks, and each one needs 4 of each size of these per block. So it's 16 times 4 for each one. So if you're doing a different size quilt and making more blocks, that's how you work it out. I took all my 2.5-inch squares and I laid them out in rows of 4. I made sure that no two identical fabrics were next to each other. I wanted the variety. And then these 4 are laid out in a row of 4. And I like to do mine in strips. You don't have to. Some people like to sew, a 4 and a 4. But the reason I like to do strips is because it's easy then for me to take them to the ironing board, and I'll iron all this row in that direction and all the next row in that direction. When I come to sew these together now, these all nest really nicely and they will just sew together well. There's 16 squares in each block, and there's 16 blocks in this quilt. The next thing I'm going to do is pin them, sew a 1/4 inch along here, and just sew all 4 rows together. And what I did just to make it easier was I actually laid all mine out on the floor. So I've got 16 separate blocks on the floor because I just wanted to make sure there was enough variety, so I didn't end up with one block that had all the same, same kind of colours in it. So then I just picked them up one at a time, made sure they all stayed in the same order, and sewed them together. So I actually kind of put a pin keeping these in order. I've got a block here ready that I'm just going to sew. As you can see, it looks pretty roughly pinned together here. And I'm just going to nest these seams quickly along here. And then sew down there 1/4 inch. when it's done, this is what we'll have. A 16 sewn all together and ready to sew in the quilt. And so the next stage will be to put the points on around the edge, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. A few tips for getting the best result to do this. One where when you sew it on, your points here meet exactly and it all lays nice and flat. Make sure you cut your squares accurately. Either press them in half or, like this one, draw a line corner to corner. Sometimes a line is really easier to see than having just a pressed line. It's a little bit hard to see that sometimes. When you sit it onto your white piece, make sure that you sit this exactly square. And when you sew, do your seam very slightly on the inside of your white line so that when you fold it back, it fits nicely. That gives you a better result. When you're sewing, put them all in a stack to make sure you sew them all the same way. And sew, let me turn that one around, and sew all of one side and all of the other side. When you've done that, just lay them together and make sure that you've really done it correctly before you trim. Once you've trimmed these, there's no fixing it, so you want to make sure you've got them right. So the best thing would be to take the top one off each pile, trim it off, you want to trim about 1/4 of an inch. Then when you press it back, you can see, well, I probably should turn them in the other direction so you can see that that is going to make your triangle. So press all of these open and trim them. Now you're ready to sew your 2 halves together. Fold them right sides together. Now up here at the diagonal point, you want to line these diagonals up. So the easiest way to do it is to open one side and just kind of push them together, and you can feel where they lock together on the inside. When you've done that, let that seam flop open and put a pin in there. And a pin at the bottom. Then you're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch seam down here, and don't make your seam here too scant, because if you do, when you sew your next row on, you'll cut the point of your triangle off. So take a good 1/4 of an inch, not a scant one. Then when you open it up, your point is good. When you sew this seam across the top, it won't cut the top of your point off. And the last thing I want to show you is that I'm not going to press this open, because when I put it onto this piece it's going to be joined to, these are already pressed in place and joined to other seams. So whichever way that lies, just finger press. So in this case, it'll be like that. Just finger press this for the moment, nest it together and go ahead and sew. And then you can press it all when it's finished. It'll lay nice and flat for you. To make the rest of the square, we have to attach these. These are the 2 4.5 inch with the triangles, and we have to attach one to the top and one to the bottom. The points face outwards on every side. So I'm just going to put that face to face, pin it on there, Then I'm going to sew 1/4 inch down that edge. Now I'm going to press that open, and I'm not going to show you it on camera because each side is exactly the same. So I'm going to sew another of the 4.5 inch blocks on the bottom, and then I'll take 2 of my 6.5 inch blocks and sew them one on each side, and then I'll show you what the finished block looks like. With those sewn on, this is what the block looks like. I have 16 of these. I'm going to lay them in 4 rows, 4 blocks each row. I'm sewing these blocks together now. I'm just doing strips of 4. I'm doing them totally in a random order. So I've sewn those 3. I'm just going to sew the last one on. Then I'll lay this down and do the next strip. They're going together quite well. This seam here is quite bulky, but my sewing machine is handling it, and it's going to be fine. So I'm just going to go ahead and sew. I've pinned along here, and I'm going to sew this, and this is still all 1/4 inch seam. Now I'm not chain sewing this in this case. I've pinned it just the way that I want it to be, and I'm just doing each one individually. Just a little bit slower over that bulky bit. And I did carefully pin these points so that they would match exactly. And of course, I know I'm going to make another of these quilts, so I'm also just sewing these little 2.5 inch squares together as I'm sewing it. I'm doing that instead of that little piece of waste fabric. Did you notice me doing that earlier? I'll have quite a few of these done by the time I've done all this. So what I'm going to do now is the next strip set, then I'll join the 2 rows together on and on down till all the 4 are put together. So it'll be 16, 4 blocks on each row and 4 rows. So I've pinned all this long row together, and I'm just going to sew along this seam. And again, I'm just doing 1/4 inch seam, and all these points I'm matching so that when it's finished, those points will point at each other. And you'll see that when I open it out. You don't have to have these blocks a certain way around because they're all the same. So I'm just opening this up so that you can see 2 rows sewn together. So there, can you see how the points are pointing at each other? Maybe you can see the points lining up better here. They're all in a nice line. And as I come down and where the next row is sewn on, then they're pointing to each other in the other direction. So you get a better finish when you try just to be a bit careful with this this little area here. And the last thing I did was just add this 2.5 inch border all around. This is the Arkansas crossing. It's a great scrappy quilt. If you've enjoyed this, press the notification bell for more of my videos. Thanks for watching.